Thank you. So, who here has been in post-contract after ECI project with a lot of variations, kind of not really knowing why or how we got there? I think what kind of helps. No, I saw a couple of contractors from up here. Um, I think what kind of helps that is now you may not prevent that, but what helps is being able to look back at a document that clearly shows what actually happened. Because I feel like we get in these scenarios and we just don't really know what happened. Everyone's forgotten. And we go back, and in the worst case, the ECI agreement's a one-pager that didn't really set out the actual scope and requirements of what the contractor and the client were actually getting involved in. So I just want to kick off with a few points around that. So obviously an ECI can go two ways, where it's client-led, and that's very common for New Zealand, where the client still ultimately at the end still owns the design risk unless parts of it are contracted out. What's more common over the ditch Australia is you go through ECI and the actual design team novates across and you end up in a design build sort of situation. But it's just, for whatever reason in New Zealand, that's just not quite as common. You don't see it as much as over in Australia. So a good ECI agreement, I've kind of got 10 points here about what it would have. And there was a chap in the middle over there saying he'd had a bad experience. If you get given an ECI agreement that's a one-pager, reverse brief it back at the minimum with some of these points, hopefully. So then you're really clear on what you're signing up for. So first one, this sounds really simple, but you never see it, and it's a project brief. It's like it'd be from the client, like, why are we getting involved in ECI? What are we trying to do? Like, why are we here? It's really a key little piece that would also include some objectives of what we're trying to do, why we're coming to a contractor with an ECI agreement in the first place, provides the contractor with some initial clarity on what they're getting involved with or what they're potentially bidding on, more times than not, a P&G margin ECI to kick things off. The second is a term, not only for the ECI agreement, but especially for New Zealand, often it's that two-stage tendering thing, an actual date of when the client needs a lump sum fixed price to be entered into. So you've got that clarity of what the program is broadly straight away, right up front. Understanding a bit about the client and what they need. Point 3 is general obligations, that there's a reasonable skill and care obligation on the contractor. Unless it is a design build, then that the fit for purpose sort of obligation comes in. But most part, it's a reasonable skill and care obligation on the contractor in terms of negligence. It should be open book. That, to a point that was just raised before, it is handy that some, maybe not ideally all, but or not always practical, that personnel that are pre-contract services are carried through into construction. Have had those scenarios where the post-contract team are like, oh yeah, that was those guys, yeah, they're in that other building down the road, yeah, we don't know them. Like, that exaggerated example, and I know it's not practical to get everyone across, but having some transfer of knowledge and people continuing on is really key and good to have up front in the agreement. And it's good to also have good faith obligations in there, just to make things run smoothly, I guess, in terms of that sort of semi-non-contractual element. Number 4 is scope, probably the most important part and the most commonly not very well defined in these agreements. So I've listed a bunch of bullet points. We got roles and responsibilities, decision-making protocols, reporting and communication structure. Those points, what I'm getting at is if the contractor goes, nah, that detail there, I need 4 more nogs and a jack stud, and then the designer that's still ultimately holding that responsibility chooses not to incorporate that, it needs to be documented so that, to my point at the start, when we're in post-contract and we go, how do we get here, and there's a variation, you've got a record of it. So there needs to be that structure and that management tracking. What do you want from the contractor in the ECI agreement? Do you want them to provide cost advice? Because you might not. Well, I can do that as a PQS. You know, ideally it's better with the contractor, but maybe it's just me. Do you want buildability input? Do you want them at design meetings? Do you, like, you can see where I'm going with this. Why not make this as detailed as possible? Like, for example, a lot of what I do, my biggest impact are at milestone estimate points, concept, preliminary design, develop design, etc. And in simple terms, you could have an ECI agreement where you go, don't come to meetings. We're going to give you all the documents at preliminary design. Please mark it up. Tell us where to put the crane, what the access is like, if is the program right. You know, that's a real simple example, but you could actually look at doing that. But again, it's what is the scope? Do you want risk identification? Do you want that input into practical site stuff? Where's the crane? Where's access? What issues do we have around that the consultants might overlook? On the 2-stage trade letting example, which is very, very common, sub-trade letting, it's important in the ECI agreement for the commercial team to understand the process that's going to go through. Like, does the contractor do the letting documents? Is it on Aconex Procore? How many bids are we expecting to see? And if you can't get 3 subcontract prices or whatever it is, what's the protocol? Is it, sorry, it's non-compliant? It's not always the reality with a tricky facade or something like that. It might be one price. It's having the reasoning why and understanding that. And then understanding the recommendation process from that point that myself as a PQS would be then recommending to the client. 5 is an offer, obviously offer and acceptance for the ECI fee, but also good to point out and plan out what the process is for coming into a lump sum agreement for a fixed price lump sum contract. Also having that in there so it's real clear. 6 is payment for services for the contractor. Do believe that contractors should be paid for these services. It kind of devalues the whole thing, I think, and if the contractor isn't paid. And I've seen those sort of clauses where it's like, well, if you win the lump sum, you give back your ECI fee. It just doesn't feel right and doesn't seem fair. 7, principals obligations, so work openly, provide information in a timely manner, respond timely. Then 8 and 9, suspension to termination, but both parties giving notice for whatever reason. Like, obviously there'd be exit points that the client would be very interested in. That's been mentioned by Donna, if things aren't performing well. But equally for the contractor, there should be an avenue that if for whatever reason they need to get out, there should be a period of time there that a clause to enable them to get out. Limitation of liability is 9. Actually, sub point 8 is a variation clause, just in case you actually go, yep, we just want you to look at each design drop only. This is like a lightweight ECI, and actually you get halfway through and go, nah, let's bring in, we want them doing cost budgeting, optioneering. So you enable that without destroying a contract. Limitation of liability is 9, which is an interesting one. Generally, it's the contractor is like a consultant in a way, the way they're employed in the ECI agreement, where they've got a reasonable skill and care obligation. The indemnity, they'll take out professional indemnity insurance, which is normally capped to the ECI fee, or like a multiple of up to maybe 5 times the fee. And that would have to extend for a period of time, probably up to 10 years potentially. Potentially public liability insurance as well, if you're doing site visits and stuff like that. And then a disputes kind of process. So I probably said a lot just then, but it's all kind of straightforward. So just don't sign a one-pager. There's no reason to. In terms of liability, my view on this, I've talked around the office a little bit, so this could be a bit of havoc, but ultimately, whoever, in my view, whoever produces the specification or the drawings, they're the ones that have the liability. So there might be elements through ECI as you come into fixed price that are decided will be contractor design build, and you can do that. But ultimately, it's a reasonable skill and care obligation on the contractor. It's not a fit for purpose obligation unless they're heading into a design build contract. So if it's lump sum, it's still reasonable skill and care obligation. So the architect, engineers are still going to be producing the contract drawings. So that's why it's really important to have everything documented about things the contractor said that came into the design or didn't. But ultimately, that the architect reviewing that advice needs to go, yep, you know what, studs at 200 centres, you know, like I'm happy with that. So that's kind of my take on it. The contractor should also be paid for the services because it actually avoids any potential disputes over intellectual property. And yeah, I did have some stories around insurers potentially refusing coverage or having higher premiums when you've got really poorly scoped ECI agreements. So it's another one to keep an eye out. In terms of open book approaches and competitive pricing, like I said before, generally we do see, we'll get 3 subcontractor prices through these agreements, but we do generally see contractors putting in more allowances and us having to do a bit of work to question them and work through it, which in my view you probably wouldn't see in a pure tight lump sum sort of situation, competitive tender. But like I said before, sometimes it is because the contractor's been involved for a longer period of time, so they're more aware of the risks than getting a whole bunch of documents and needing a price in a month, you know, for that lump sum situation. So it's a hard one to answer, and a good ECI is bloody hard to measure. But yeah, and do you get a lower final account and a higher initial price? I don't know, maybe. But yeah, that's pretty much me. The client just will really want to see competitive tension is still delivered through an ECI. That's what they're really interested in. Yeah, and the bad ones are ones where it's like everything's one price, shitloads of allowances, and everyone's going, feel like you're getting held ransom basically. Yeah, there you go.
So someone asked the question over there about how do you make this a smooth process, and it's pretty much what you just said, but I'll shorten it up a bit.
Yeah.
As contractors, particularly if you're going into a competitive ECI process, you're a taker of a document and you're pricing it, and you might think this is a pretty crap document. I've just been warned, don't price a one-page of scope. You've got to get better at, as Brad said, reverse briefing it back and saying, well, here's what you've asked for, but here's what you should have asked for. If you're in a situation where you're working with a client on a relationship basis and they've said, I've got a budget problem, and so I think I'm going to solve that by doing ECI, and you're going to somehow magically get the price down, but I'm not going to change scope, then you've got to be everyone wants to get the job, and you don't sort of start by saying no, and that won't work. But you've got to the industry's got to get better at at putting the best foot forward in that tender process and saying these are the sort of things that we can provide to you based on what you've told us about your project. Here's an example of a design review report, and we'll do you 3 of these and we'll charge you 20 grand a report. Here's a example of buildability analysis or something like that, and so the bigger contractors, and Nailers would be one of them, are getting better at charging for their services. The industry's really crap at charging for their services. I mean, everyone makes a commercial decision about how badly they want the job and to what extent they're willing to do a loss leader, but to do a good job of an ECI process, which they usually run for maybe 6 months, then you've got to put good people on it and actually deliver some hard deliverables that can be measured and gone back and read later on to see what they, if you can't remember what the contractor said at the time, and the client should be willing to pay money for that. And if they're not willing to pay money for it, well, they're not valuing what they're getting. They just think they're getting some free advice.
And I agree. Of course, I'll agree. But you don't value anything you get for free, do you? So you have to put a value on a service that you're going to get. In terms of the scope, whenever I look at an ECI agreement or a PCSA, I'm not actually too worried about the specific terms. What I am interested in is the scope that we are down to provide, because that is the most important part. Because we've got to be able to deliver to that, and we'd prefer to see a defined scope so we know that we're delivering to it, we've met expectations, we can tick the box when it's done, and that's actually been delivered, so we don't keep having the same conversation that there's no value in the ECI model. So I think that's a big step that we need to move on with. And the other one that Brad, you mentioned, liability. It's a really interesting point about liability through an ECI, and I agree with what you say. But even from a contractor, we don't mind taking some liability, but it's quite complicated, because we may have some solutions, or we come in too late in detailed design. We might have some solutions or optioneering, but if they're not adopted, we can't be held liable for offering, a solution or an option to do something. So it gets really complicated around the liability piece, and we've probably got to have bigger conversations around it.
I mean, that's a really complex situation. We could spend hours talking about that, John. If you're looking for advice on insurance, well, no one, even insurers, don't understand insurance. And as far as liability goes, in a ECI where it's not D&C, largely the contractor's not taking it. They can talk their heart's content. They're not picking up a whole lot of liability. In theory, they could, there could be some path back to them as a construction consultant with a duty, reasonable skill and care. And we did have an example on one of Shane's projects, we won't name it, where there were, felt like about 2 kilometres of seismic joint, and somewhere back in the ECI process, so it wasn't a D&C, some advice was given by a supplier of, grouts to a supplier of seismic joints about what grout would be suitable to infill this, and then come to build it, and it's like the grout's failing. It's like, whose idea was this? And everyone's going, well, the architect spec'd it, and the architect said, yeah, but you, before we let the contract, you said that this was appropriate. And I didn't say it. It was that guy from the company who sells the grout, and that company had sort of all of a sudden had memory loss and had 2 different data sheets for the same product. One of them said it stuck to aluminium, and the other one said it didn't. And so, we never went there, but quite an interesting liability case where it seemed to go back to some advice that was given in the ECI phase in a relatively informal way that found itself embedded in a design, and then the same contractor and their subs turned around once we were building and said, oh no, that won't work. So liability, tricky. In a D&C, we're doing a lot of work on that job with Generous about lining up design liability with overall contract liability. Contractors got a liability which is a large percentage of the contract value, but they've got subcaps around design liability, and so they're picking up whatever the client manages to get out of their design consultants before they engage them. But the insurer passed an interesting comment. He said, well, that's not really for you. That's actually a legal defence fund. So if you ask for 10 million of PI, that means the designer employs a $10 million lawyer to fight that case, and you know, you're not necessarily going to get that money. So you know, the more money you ask for, the bigger and uglier the lawyer is who's sitting across the table when you get into an argument.